My name is Sarah Catherine Morrison, and at 33 years old, I'm a captain in the United States Army. But on my wedding day, none of that mattered. In front of 280 guests, CEOs, generals, Army Rangers, and my father's entire board of directors, he slapped me. The sound cracked through St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, drowning out the final trembling notes of the organ. He pointed at the row of ribbons over my heart and roared at me to take off those silly pieces of metal. He was talking about the Bronze Star, the one I earned in Kandahar pulling a 19-year-old private out of a kill zone while RPGs screamed overhead. It was his final wedding gift to me, a public humiliation designed to break me in front of everyone who mattered in his world and mine. He thought he'd won, thought I would crumble the way I always had, the way my mother had for 25 years before cancer finally released her from his ledger book tyranny. But my father made one fatal miscalculation that morning. He did it in front of my real family, and he did it exactly 72 hours after I signed the paperwork that made me the second largest shareholder of Morrison Development Corporation. The company he'd spent 35 years building, the empire he'd constructed on stolen ground and forged signatures, now had a new owner for 40.1% of its shares. The daughter he'd assigned a value of $0 in his precious balance sheet now owned enough voting power to remove him from the throne. And 5 minutes after that slap echoed through the cathedral, the board of directors would do exactly that. But to understand how a father could strike his daughter at the altar, and how that daughter could own nearly half his company without him knowing, I have to take you back 33 years. Back to the day I was born into a family where everything, and I mean everything, was measured in dollars and cents. Before I tell this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button if you believe honor can't be bought, but justice sometimes can be. And subscribe, because what I'm about to share proves that the most valuable inheritance isn't money. It's the courage to use it. The Morrison family didn't celebrate Thanksgiving the way normal families did. There was no warmth in our dining room on that fourth Thursday of November, no genuine gratitude floating through the air, alongside the smell of sage stuffing and roasted turkey. Our Thanksgiving was a corporate event masquerading as a holiday, and the real feast didn't happen until after the pumpkin pie had been cleared away and the coffee poured. That's when my father would push back from the head of the table, disappear into his study for exactly 90 seconds, and return carrying a book that seemed to weigh more than any Bible I'd ever seen. The Morrison family balance sheet, established 1987, the year he married my mother, bound in navy leather so dark it looked black in certain light, with gold leaf lettering that caught the chandelier's glow and threw it back like a taunt. He would set it down at his place with a soft, authoritative thud that made the silverware jump, and we would all go silent. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The ritual never varied. He'd put on his reading glasses, the expensive wire-rimmed ones that made him look like a judge about to pass sentence, and open to the first marked page. My oldest brother Brandon would be called first, and my father's voice would boom through the room with manufactured pride as he announced the year's contribution. Brandon, age 35 now but only 20 back then, had secured a logistics contract with Procorp that netted the company $2 million. The scratch of my father's fountain pen against that thick cream paper was the only sound as he recorded the number in Brandon's column. We would applaud, always, because that was the script. Brandon would nod, accepting the recognition as his natural due, the heir apparent who understood that love in the Morrison household was a line item, not a feeling. Then Matthew, my middle brother, 2 years younger than Brandon, but already learning to play the game. The downtown residential project, managed efficiently, brought in under budget with a value of $800,000. Another scratch of the pen. Another round of polite, hollow applause. My brothers would sit a little straighter, their worth confirmed for another year, their place in the family hierarchy documented in permanent ink. For years, I had no entry. I was just a child, a daughter, a line item with no profit attached. But I dreaded the year my turn would come, and when I turned 18, it arrived like an execution date I'd been counting down to my entire life. I had spent 6 months of my junior year developing a project for the Texas statewide science fair, a structural engineering analysis of composite materials for cable-stayed bridges, new methodology for testing load-bearing capacity that MIT would later call innovative. It won first place in South Carolina, beating out 300 other projects. I was bursting with pride, not because I thought it would earn my father's love, but because for the first time in my life, I had something to bring to that table that connected to his world. Engineering, construction, the language he spoke. When my turn came at Thanksgiving dinner that year, I stood up with my heart hammering against my ribs so hard, I thought everyone could hear it. I explained the methodology, the potential applications for real-world bridge construction, the way the composite materials could reduce costs by 15% while increasing structural integrity. My father listened, nodding slowly, his expression carefully neutral in a way I desperately wanted to interpret as approval. When I finished, scattered applause rippled through the room, hesitant and uncertain, like no one was quite sure what the appropriate response was to a daughter who just presented science instead of domestic achievement. My father looked at me for a long moment. Then he opened the ledger to my page, the first page that had ever borne my name. He wrote down the title of my project in his neat, decisive script, the fountain pen gliding across the paper with practiced ease. Then he moved to the final column, the one that mattered, the only one that had ever mattered in this house. He paused, and in that pause, I felt hope bloom in my chest like a foolish, stubborn weed. He wrote a large, bold, unmistakable figure, $0.00. He looked up, meeting my eyes over the rim of his reading glasses, and addressed the table, even though his words were aimed directly at my heart like bullets designed to shatter on impact. If it doesn't sell, it has no value. An important lesson, Sarah. Welcome to the real world. The humiliation was a physical thing, a fist closing around my lungs and squeezing until I couldn't draw breath. I sat down, my face burning with shame so intense it felt like fever, and stared at my empty dessert plate. I didn't hear what was said after that. The world had gone silent the way it would years later in that cathedral. A thick, suffocating quiet that pressed against my eardrums and made my pulse sound like thunder. That night, my mother came into my room. She didn't hug me, didn't offer the kind of comfort that involved touch or tears. That wasn't her way, had never been her way in this house where crying was weakness and weakness was failure. Instead, she sat on the edge of my bed and told me a story I'd never heard before, her voice soft enough that I had to lean in to catch every word. "Before I married your father," she said, "I owned a small flower shop on King Street in Charleston. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I built it from nothing over 3 years, learned the business, made it profitable. Eleanor's garden, I called it." She paused, and in the dim light from my bedside lamp, I could see her hands twisting in her lap, wringing an invisible cloth the way they always did when she was forcing herself to speak a truth she'd kept locked away for too long. "When we got engaged, your father convinced me to sell it. Said I needed to focus on family, on being the kind of wife a man in his position deserved. But the truth, and it took me 20 years to admit this even to myself, was that he couldn't stand me having something he didn't own or control." She took my hand, her fingers cool and gentle, but her grip surprisingly strong. "He bought it through a shell company for $45,000, well under market value. 5 years later, that company sold the property for $890,000. He made nearly $1 million off my dreams, Sarah, and I got nothing but his last name and this house. Don't let him buy your soul, my daughter. It's worth more than all the numbers in that book." She stood to leave, but turned back at the door and pulled something from her cardigan pocket. An old photograph, the edges soft from handling. Her in front of a storefront, young and radiant in a way I'd never seen her look in our house, surrounded by buckets of flowers in riotous bloom. She handed it to me, and when I turned it over, I found words written in her careful script on the back. "To Sarah, build your garden where he can't reach. The deed is in the safety box. Love, Mom." I didn't understand what she meant. Wouldn't understand for 15 more years. Not until I'd walked through fire in 2 deserts, and learned that some fights can't be won with silence and patience. Some fights require strategy, resources, and the kind of cold calculation that my father would have recognized if he'd ever bothered to look at me as anything other than a failed investment. 6 months after that Thanksgiving, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. It had already metastasized to her bones by the time they found it, which meant she'd been living with pain for months, maybe years, and never said a word. That was Eleanor Morrison for you. Suffer in silence, maintain appearances, never let them see you break. She refused the final round of chemotherapy, and when I asked her why, expecting some speech about quality of life or not wanting to suffer, she looked at me with clear eyes and said something that didn't make sense until much later. I don't want to spend my last days fighting the cancer, Sarah. I want to spend them preparing you. We buried her on a cold February morning 6 months before my 19th birthday. The church was full of my father's business associates, Brandon's friends from his MBA program, Matthew's college fraternity brothers, a sea of expensive suits and performative grief. I stood between my brothers in a black dress my father had picked out, listening to a minister who'd never met my mother describe a woman who sounded nothing like her and felt absolutely nothing. The numbness was complete, a mercy I didn't deserve but accepted anyway. 2 nights after the funeral, while my father was locked in his study doing whatever men like him do when their wives die, probably updating the ledger to reflect the life insurance payout, I went through my mother's things. Matthew had offered to help, had shown up at my bedroom door with red-rimmed eyes and the kind of guilt that sits heavy on the shoulders of people who never said the things they should have while there was still time. We worked in silence, folding clothes that still smelled like her perfume, packing away books she'd loved, clearing out the closet of a life that had been smaller than it should have been. In her nightstand, tucked into the pages of the Bible she'd read every morning before my father woke up, I found a single sheet of paper, photocopied, not original, the edges slightly blurred the way they get when someone's copied something in a hurry, maybe in secret. It was a page from the Morrison family balance sheet, but not one I'd ever seen during those Thanksgiving rituals. This page was about my mother, Eleanor Grace Morrison, née Hartley. Flower shop sale, forced, $45,000. Inheritance from parents, absorbed upon marriage, $120,000. 25 years of domestic management, no monetary value assigned. Net contribution to Morrison Industries, $0.00. And at the bottom, in my father's handwriting, a note that made my hand shake so badly I nearly dropped the paper. Non-revenue generating asset. Emotional value only. He'd done it to her too. Had been doing it their entire marriage. My mother, who'd built a business from nothing and sold it at his insistence for a fraction of its worth, who'd brought over $100,000 to the marriage as inheritance and watched him fold it into his company without a word of gratitude, who'd managed his home and raised his children and stood beside him at 1,000 corporate functions, with a smile that never reached her eyes. She'd been assigned the same value I had, 0. And now she was gone. And I was holding proof that this wasn't just about me. This was a pattern, a system, the way William Morrison operated in the world. He took and he took and he took, and then he wrote it all down in neat columns that erased the humanity of everyone around him. I was still staring at that paper when Matthew came back into the room carrying a small carved wooden box. "Found this in the back of her closet," he said quietly. "It has your name on it." He set it on the bed between us, and we both looked at it like it might contain something dangerous. In a way, it did. Inside the box, my mother's keepsakes. A pressed flower, brown and brittle with age, a few photographs of her parents, who died before I was born, a small address book filled with names I didn't recognize, and underneath it all, a key on a simple metal ring with a tag attached. The tag bore my mother's handwriting, unmistakable even in its shaky late-stage script. Wells Fargo, King Street Branch, Safety Box 347, for Sarah's 19th birthday. I was 18 years, 364 days old. One day shy of the age when I'd legally own whatever was in that box without needing my father's signature. Matthew saw me calculating, saw the recognition dawn, and something passed between us that had never existed before. An alliance, fragile and unspoken, but real. He's in the study until at least midnight, Matthew said. His voice was barely above a whisper, even though we were alone in the house's second floor. If you need to go somewhere tomorrow, I'll cover for you. Tell him you're with me, getting fresh air or some bullshit. He'll believe me. Why are you helping me? I asked. We'd never been close, Matthew and I. He'd always been too busy trying to stay out of Brandon's shadow and our father's line of fire to pay much attention to the sister who didn't matter. He looked at me for a long moment, then down at that photocopied page still in my hands. Because Mom asked me to, he finally said. 3 weeks before she died, she gave me something to hold on to, made me promise to give it to you at the right time. I think tomorrow is that time. The next morning, I drove to the Wells Fargo on King Street, with Matthew riding shotgun, both of us silent, both knowing we were crossing a line my father had drawn in invisible ink, but that we'd all learn to see anyway. The bank manager, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a professional bun, took the key and my ID, compared my birth date to whatever record she had, and led me to a small private room with a table and 2 chairs and walls so thick I couldn't hear the normal sounds of the bank beyond them. She brought me the safety deposit box, long and narrow and heavier than I expected, and left me alone with it. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside, I found 3 things that would change my life. First, a certificate for a life insurance policy in my mother's name. $500,000 purchased secretly 10 years earlier through a company I'd never heard of, with one listed beneficiary, Sarah Catherine Morrison. My father had no idea this existed. I was sure of it, because if he had known, it would have been absorbed into his empire the way her inheritance had been, the way everything my mother had ever owned or earned had disappeared into the Morrison Industries machine. Second, a property deed. 12 acres of undeveloped land on the outskirts of Charleston, near where the new highway interchange was being built, purchased 15 years earlier, and held in the name Eleanor G. Hartley, her maiden name. Land my father couldn't touch because, legally, on paper, Eleanor Hartley and Eleanor Morrison were 2 different people, and he'd never thought to check what his wife had done before she married him. Third, a letter. 8 pages in my mother's handwriting. The first page dated 2 weeks before her cancer diagnosis. The rest added in installments over the following months, as she got sicker and her writing got shakier, but her message got clearer. My dearest Sarah, it began, and I had to stop reading and press my palms against my eyes to keep from crying in that sterile little room. If you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm so sorry I wasn't strong enough to fight while I was alive. But I did fight, sweetheart, just not the way you might think. I fought in silence, the only way I knew how, by hiding things from him. The insurance policy, the land, these are yours. I put them in a trust called Eleanor's Garden Trust, and you get access when you turn 19, because I knew he'd find a way to control it if you got it any earlier. Don't use this money to buy his love or his approval, Sarah. Use it to build your own garden, somewhere he can never reach. Use it to become the person I couldn't be. One more thing, and this is important. Do you remember me mentioning my younger sister, Maria? We haven't spoken in 20 years because your father didn't approve of her choices. She joined the military, became a drill sergeant, refused to settle down and have babies the way he thought women should. If you ever meet a drill sergeant, Maria Chen, at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, that's her. She took her husband's last name, but she's my sister. She's your aunt. I wrote to her 3 months ago, told her you might come looking for her someday. Told her if you did, to teach you what I couldn't, how to fight back. Be strong, my daughter. Build something that's truly yours. And never, ever let him tell you what you're worth. I love you more than any number in any ledger could ever measure. Mom. I sat in that room for 20 minutes after I finished reading, letting the words sink in, letting the full scope of what my mother had done rearrange my understanding of her life. She hadn't been weak. She'd been strategic. She'd spent 18 years quietly building an escape route for me while living under the thumb of a man who measured her value in dollars and found her worthless. $500,000 in insurance, 12 acres of land that, according to a recent appraisal note tucked into the deed, was now worth roughly $400,000 thanks to the highway development. My mother had left me nearly $1 million in assets my father didn't know existed. And she'd left me an aunt I'd never met who could teach me how to be something other than William Morrison's disappointing daughter. When I emerged from that room, Matthew was waiting in the lobby, pretending to read a banking brochure but watching the hallway. I disappeared down like a soldier on guard duty. His eyes met mine, and I knew he could see the change in me, the way carrying a secret that big shifts your entire center of gravity. "We need to talk," I said. "Somewhere Dad will never think to look." We drove to a coffee shop in North Charleston, the kind of place where Morrison Development had never built anything and never would, where the clientele was working-class people on their lunch breaks and college students avoiding their assignments. I showed Matthew the letter, watched him read it twice, saw his face go through the same journey mine had. Shock, recognition, guilt, and finally something that looked almost like relief. "I'm sorry," he said when he finally looked up. "I should have given you this sooner." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, my name written on it in my mother's handwriting. "She gave it to me the week before she died. Made me swear I'd wait until you found the safety deposit box. Said you'd need both pieces together to understand." I opened it with hands that had stopped shaking and started to feel steady for the first time since my father had written that 0 next to my science project 3 years earlier. Inside was a single piece of paper with a name, a phone number, and a short note. "Mr. James Patterson, estate attorney. He knows everything. He'll help you invest the trust properly when you're ready. And Sarah, your father doesn't know about any of this. Keep it that way until you're strong enough to use it. Trust is a weapon, but only if your enemy doesn't see it coming." I looked at my brother across that coffee shop table. Really looked at him for maybe the first time in our lives. "Why didn't you tell Dad about this?" I asked. "You could have scored major points with him, shown him the money, turned me in for hiding assets. Why help me?" Matthew was quiet for a long time, turning his coffee cup in small circles on the table, watching the liquid swirl. "Because I watched him destroy her," he finally said. "Watched him take this brilliant, creative woman and turn her into nothing. And I didn't do a damn thing to stop it." His voice cracked on the last word. "I can't fix what happened to Mom, Sarah, but maybe I can help make sure it doesn't happen to you." 6 weeks later, on the morning of my 19th birthday, I walked into my father's study without knocking. He looked up from his desk, surprised and annoyed by the interruption, and I watched his face as I spoke the words I'd been practicing in the mirror for days. "I'm enlisting in the Army. I'm refusing the trust fund you set up. I won't take the monthly allowance. And I will never work for Morrison Industries." Brandon, who'd been standing by the window reviewing some contract, actually laughed out loud. "You're going to live on a soldier's salary? Do you even know what that is? Maybe $3,000 a month if you're lucky? Good luck with that, little sister." I kept my eyes on my father. "I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, it's mine, not yours." I turned and walked out before he could respond, before the old trained reflex to apologize and backtrack could kick in. Matthew was waiting in the hallway, and we exchanged the smallest of nods as I passed, an acknowledgement of something that had shifted between us, some understanding that we were on different sides of a war that hadn't been formally declared but had been raging in that house since the day I was born. 3 months later, I stood in a processing line at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, surrounded by other new recruits, all of us about to start officer candidate school. My possessions fit in a single duffel bag. My bank account held exactly $1,200, everything I'd saved from my part-time job in high school. The Eleanor's Garden Trust was sitting in an investment account, growing slowly under the management of Mr. Patterson, who'd set up a conservative portfolio designed for long-term growth. I told him I didn't need the money yet, that I was playing a longer game than anyone in my family could possibly imagine. But I had no idea how long that game would take, or how much it would cost me before I was done. The woman who would teach me how to survive it, how to become something harder and sharper than William Morrison could ever comprehend, was waiting for me in the 3rd week of training. Drill Sergeant Maria Chen, 45 years old, 5'5" of pure concentrated fury, wrapped in an Army combat uniform. She read every recruit's file, I learned later, because she believed in knowing exactly who she was forging in her crucible. When she got to mine and saw the name Morrison next to the next of kin line, saw William Morrison listed as CEO of Morrison Development Corporation. I watched something flicker across her face. Not recognition exactly, something deeper. Knowledge. She made it her personal mission to find out what I was made of, whether the daughter of wealth and privilege could become something useful, or if I'd break the first time things got hard. She assigned me the longest ruck marches, the most complex land navigation courses, the first slot for every hand-to-hand combat demonstration. She rode me harder than anyone else in my OCS class, and I knew why. She was waiting for me to quit, waiting for me to prove I was just another rich kid playing soldier until the game stopped being fun. The breaking point came during a field training exercise 36 hours into a continuous operation, with almost no sleep and minimal food and water. We were running movement drills through swampland, and I was on my 32nd hour of being awake. Exhaustion sat on my shoulders like physical weight, made my vision blur at the edges, turned my legs to rubber that barely supported my weight. I felt my knees start to buckle, felt the ground rushing up to meet me, and knew I was about to go down hard. That's when Drill Sergeant Chen appeared beside me. She didn't offer a hand, didn't offer water, just stood there, her shadow falling across me, her expression unreadable. "Pain is temporary, Lieutenant," she said, her voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the fog in my brain. "But honor is forever." She wasn't tormenting me. She was teaching me, showing me that out here, in this place, my last name meant nothing. The Morrison family balance sheet held no value. The only currency that mattered was grit, and you couldn't buy it or inherit it. You had to earn it one painful step at a time. I took a deep breath, pushed myself back to my full height, and kept moving. That was the moment I passed Maria Chen's test, though I didn't know it yet. Didn't know she was my mother's sister. Didn't know she'd been watching for me ever since Eleanor's letter arrived 3 months before the cancer diagnosis. A letter that had warned Maria that her niece might need her someday. All I knew was that I'd found the place where I could build something my father's ledger couldn't touch. 18 months later, I was a first lieutenant stationed in Baghdad, Iraq. My first deployment, 12 months in the desert, learning what it meant to lead soldiers in a combat zone, to make decisions where the wrong call could get people killed. It changed me in ways I'm still cataloging, turned me from someone who flinched at raised voices into someone who could stand steady while rockets screamed overhead. Near the end of that deployment, in a moment of weakness or maybe hope, I wrote a letter to my father, 4 pages, single-spaced, pouring out everything I'd learned about leadership and responsibility, and what it meant to build a legacy out of people instead of buildings. I told him about my soldiers, about the weight of keeping them alive, about learning that the most valuable things you can create are bonds of trust and loyalty that can't be measured in quarterly earnings. I sealed it in an envelope and mailed it to Morrison Industries headquarters in Charleston, telling myself not to expect a reply, but hoping anyway, because hope is a stubborn thing that refuses to die even when you know better. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at my mail station in Baghdad. Heavy, corporate, the return address printed in Morrison Industries letterhead. My hands trembled as I opened it, some foolish part of me still believing that maybe this time would be different, that maybe my father had finally seen me. Inside, there was no letter from him, just my own 4-page letter torn neatly into 4 equal squares. The message was clear, brutal, unmistakable. He hadn't just rejected my words. He'd negated my entire experience, my deployment, my growth, everything I'd tried to share. Torn it up and sent it back across 6,000 miles without a single word of response. I sat there in the mailroom staring at those 4 pieces of paper, feeling something inside me finally break clean through. Not my spirit, not my resolve. The last fragile thread of hope that William Morrison might someday see his daughter as something other than a failed line item in his precious ledger. But there was something else in the envelope. A second, smaller envelope, tucked behind the torn pages. My name on it in Matthew's handwriting, not my father's. My hands were steadier now as I opened it. Matthew's letter was short, written in the careful language of someone who knows his words might be intercepted, read by the wrong eyes. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I've been holding this for 14 years. Mom told me to give it to you when the time was right. I think this is that time." Inside his envelope was a third one, this one marked with dates and official-looking stamps. And inside that, 3 documents that made my vision go white at the edges. The first was an email, 14 years old, from MIT Materials Laboratory. Subject line, Patent Acquisition Offer. Dear Ms. Sarah Morrison, your composite stress testing methodology for cable-stayed bridge materials has significant commercial value. We are prepared to offer $1,200,000 for full rights to the patent. Please have legal guardian sign. If under 21. I'd been 18 years, 364 days old when I submitted that patent application. 1 day shy of being able to sign for myself. The second document was an assignment of rights form. My signature at the bottom, or something that looked like my signature if you didn't look too closely. My father's signature as guardian. And in the transfer line, all rights assigned to Morrison Development Corporation. Compensation to Sarah Morrison, $0. The third was a bank statement from Morrison Industries showing a wire transfer from MIT Labs for exactly $1,200,000, dated 3 weeks after my 19th birthday. Noted as patent acquisition, composite materials research. Matthew's letter continued on the back of the page. I was there the day Dad made you sign. You were 18 years and 364 days old. 1 day before you turned 19 and wouldn't have needed his signature anymore. He told you it was family property, that your research belonged to the company because he'd paid for your education. You trusted him, you signed. You didn't know MIT had already offered payment. He took that money, folded it into the company, and you never saw a cent. Technically, it's fraud. You were the inventor. Even if you weren't 19 yet, you had rights. If you sued, you'd win. You could get the patent back plus damages. Or, and here's what I've been thinking about for years, you could use that $1,200,000. Because with what Mom left you in the Eleanor's Garden Trust and 14 years of compound interest on investments, you'd have enough to do something Dad would never see coming. You could buy the company out from under him. The accountant I've been secretly working with says Morrison Industries is valued at about $45 million right now. Stock trades privately, held mostly by Dad, Brandon, and a few board members. Current price is around $127 per share. With approximately $3.8 million from Eleanor's trust, properly invested and compounded, you could buy 29,921 shares. That's 38.4% of the company. Not quite 40%. Not quite enough to force a board vote without help. But if you could leverage the patent fraud, use it as pressure to force Dad to sell you another 2% at below market value, quietly, to avoid a public scandal, you'd have 40.1%. You'd be the second largest shareholder. You'd have real power. And Dad would have to listen to you for the first time in your life. I know this is a lot to drop on you in Baghdad, but I've been watching him run that company for 15 years, watching him treat it the same way he treated Mom, the same way he treats you. Like property to be managed and controlled and wrung dry of value. Maybe it's time someone took it back. Your brother, Matthew. I read that letter 3 times before the words really penetrated. Then I pulled out my phone, the satellite connection crackling and expensive, and called the number for James Patterson that my mother had left me 5 years earlier. Mr. Patterson, I said when he answered, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. This is Sarah Morrison. I need to know the exact value of Eleanor's Garden Trust today, and I need you to tell me if what I'm about to propose is legally possible. I laid it out for him. The patent fraud, the leverage, the stock purchase, the end game of owning 40% of my father's company. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then he said, in the careful voice of a lawyer who's about to commit to something that will change lives, Miss Morrison, your mother told me when she set up this trust that I should expect a call like this someday. She said you'd know when you were ready to fight back. Is that call happening right now? Yes, I said. It is. The trust currently holds $3,800,000, he said. The land has increased in value significantly due to development in that area. If we liquidate strategically and move quickly, yes, you can acquire 40.1% of Morrison Industries. And yes, we can use the patent fraud as leverage. I'll need you to send me Matthew's documents and give me authorization to proceed. One more thing, I said. No one can know about this, especially not my father. This has to be completely silent until the moment we execute. Understood, he said. Miss Morrison, your mother would be very proud. I spent that night in my small quarters in Baghdad, sitting on my bunk with those 4 torn pieces of my letter scattered on the blanket in front of me. My father had sent them back as proof of my worthlessness, as a final rejection of everything I was trying to become. He had no idea he'd just given me the motivation I needed to take his empire away from him. 6 months later, I received a brief encrypted email from James Patterson. Transaction complete. 40.1% of Morrison Industries now held in Eleanor's Garden Trust. Beneficiary Sarah Catherine Morrison. Your father received the final 2% transfer papers yesterday. He signed without reading the fine print. Congratulations, Miss Morrison. You're now the second largest shareholder. I didn't tell anyone, not even Matthew, though I suspected he knew. I finished my deployment, came home to Fort Bragg, and started preparing for the next phase. Because owning 40% of a company means nothing if you can't use it, and I wasn't ready yet to show my hand. I had one more deployment to finish, one more crucible to walk through, and a man to meet who would teach me that some things are worth more than revenge. But that's a story for another chapter. 8 months after that encrypted email confirmed I owned 40.1% of my father's company, I found myself standing in a tactical operations center at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, briefing a room full of senior officers on why their planned mission was going to get people killed. The TOC smelled like every military workspace I'd ever been in. Stale coffee that had been sitting in pots for hours, dust that no amount of cleaning could eliminate because it came in through every crack and seam, and the sharp chemical tang of jet fuel that permeated everything within a mile of an active runway. The air conditioning fought a losing battle against the Afghan heat, and everyone in the room looked tired in that specific way that comes from operating in a war zone where the threat never sleeps, even if you have to. I was there as the intelligence officer assigned to evaluate the route for an upcoming Rangers operation. They were planning to move through a valley that satellite imagery showed as clear, and on paper, it looked like the fastest way to their objective. But I'd spent 3 days analyzing those images, alongside signals intelligence and pattern of life studies, and I'd found something that made my stomach clench. The shadows were wrong, not obviously, not in a way that would jump out at someone doing a quick review, but there were heat signatures in buildings that should have been abandoned, and the timing of local traffic patterns had shifted in ways that suggested people were avoiding certain routes. Small details that individually meant nothing, but together painted a picture of a complex ambush being prepared. I laid out my analysis, pointing to the enlarged images on the screen behind me, walking the room through each piece of evidence and why it mattered. The reaction was exactly what I'd expected. Skepticism bordering on dismissal. I was a captain. They were colonels and lieutenant colonels, men with decades of experience who'd been planning operations since before I was born. A full-bird colonel whose name tape read Henderson cut me off mid-sentence. Captain Morrison, your analysis is appreciated. But we're on a tight timeline here. The intel you're citing is thin. We don't have the luxury of second-guessing every shadow in a satellite photo. Others nodded agreement. The mission had already been approved at higher levels. Pushing it back would require explanations, paperwork, the kind of bureaucratic hassle that made everyone's lives harder. I could see them calculating whether my concerns were worth that cost, and coming up with no. I opened my mouth to argue, to push harder, when a voice cut through the murmuring from the back of the room. I'll take thin. Every head turned. Standing near the back wall was a captain I didn't recognize, though his uniform and bearing marked him as special operations. Tall, lean, with the kind of controlled intensity that comes from years of living on the edge of violence. His name tape said Cross. He stepped forward, moving with an economy of motion that suggested every action had a purpose, and nothing was wasted. When he reached the front of the room, he looked at the colonel who dismissed my analysis, then at me, and his eyes were calm and absolutely certain. I trust Captain Morrison's assessment. My team doesn't move until we verify her findings. The room went silent. He'd just publicly contradicted a superior officer and put his entire mission on hold based on the word of an intelligence analyst he'd never met. It was the kind of move that could end a career, or at least earn you a reputation as difficult that would follow you forever. But more than that, it was an act of trust so complete and unconditional that it left me momentarily speechless. He was betting his soldiers' lives on my judgment, not because he knew me, Not because we had history or he owed me favors, because he'd looked at my analysis and decided it was solid, and that was enough. Colonel Henderson's face went red, but before he could respond, a brigadier general who'd been sitting quietly in the corner spoke up. Captain Cross makes a valid point. We verify the route before proceeding. Meeting adjourned. As people filed out, the captain who just derailed an entire operation to back up my intel walked over. Up close, I could see the lines around his eyes that came from squinting into desert sun, the small scars that marked someone who'd been in close combat more than once. Captain Ethan Cross, he introduced himself, extending a hand. Thank you for saving my team's lives. We don't know if I'm right yet, I pointed out, shaking his hand and finding his grip firm, but not aggressive. I know, he replied, and the small smile that crossed his face held something I hadn't seen in a long time. Absolute trust, given freely without needing proof first. That's why it matters. 3 days later, when a reconnaissance element confirmed my analysis and found a complex ambush site exactly where I'd predicted, complete with IEDs and pre-positioned heavy weapons, Ethan Cross sought me out in the intelligence section. You were right, he told me. If we'd gone in blind, half my team would be dead right now. Just doing my job, I said, uncomfortable with the gratitude in his voice because in my experience, doing your job well in the Morrison world meant you got assigned more work, not thanks. He studied me for a moment, and I had the distinct impression he was seeing something I usually kept hidden. Your job is analyzing intel. What you did was stick your neck out for people you've never met, knowing the brass might crucify you for it if you were wrong. There's a difference. A week later, he tracked me down at the DFAC during the dinner rush, found me sitting alone at a corner table with a tray of food that I'd learned not to examine too closely, because knowing what you were eating in a deployed environment sometimes made it harder to swallow. Mind if I join you? He asked, and before I could answer, he was sliding into the seat across from me with his own tray. We ate in silence for a few minutes, which should have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. Then he looked up and asked a question that no one, and I mean no one, had ever asked me before. What's the hardest command decision you've ever had to make? Not where did I go to college? Not what my father did for a living. Not any of the usual small talk that people use to establish social hierarchy and figure out where you fit in their world. He wanted to know about the moment when I'd had to choose between bad options and live with the consequences. I told him about Iraq, about a firefight that had gone sideways, about having to choose between recovering an expensive piece of surveillance equipment or evacuating a wounded soldier, about how I'd chosen the soldier without hesitation, and how I'd been formally reprimanded for losing government property, valued at over $200,000. He listened without interrupting, without that look people get when they're waiting for their turn to talk instead of actually hearing what you're saying. When I finished, he nodded slowly, processing. You chose people over equipment. That's the mark of a good leader. 4 words that rewrote my entire history. In William Morrison's world, that decision had been proof of my poor judgment, my inability to make hard choices based on cold calculation. I'd been told in writing that I'd failed to properly prioritize asset preservation. But Ethan had taken the same story and extracted a completely different lesson from it. He'd turned my documented failure into evidence of the exact quality that made someone worth following. We started talking more after that, grabbing meals together when our schedules aligned, which wasn't often given the operational tempo. I learned he'd grown up in rural Montana, that he'd joined the Army at 18 because his family couldn't afford college, that he'd worked his way up through the enlisted ranks before getting selected for officer candidate school. Everything he had, he'd earned through sheer determination and competence, the opposite of my brothers, who'd inherited their positions in Morrison Industries and treated them like birthrights. What I didn't tell him was who my father was. Didn't mention Morrison Development Corporation or the balance sheet or any of it. Out here, I was just Captain Morrison, intelligence officer, and that anonymity was precious. For the first time in my life, someone was getting to know me without the weight of my family name influencing every interaction. 6 months into my Afghanistan deployment, my platoon was conducting a patrol in Kandahar province when the world turned inside out. The ambush was textbook perfect. Multiple firing positions in the compounds flanking the road, coordinated rocket-propelled grenade strikes, heavy machine gun fire that turned the air into a steel storm. We'd driven straight into a kill zone, and the insurgents had waited until we were completely committed before opening up. In the initial barrage, I saw Private First Class Carlos Martinez go down. 19 years old, kid from El Paso who joined the Army because his single mother couldn't afford to send him to college, and he wanted to make her proud. He'd been in country for exactly 43 days. The RPG that hit near his position had caught him in the leg, and now he was lying exposed in the middle of the street with bullets kicking up dust all around him. Every tactical manual ever written says you don't run into the kill zone. You suppress the enemy, you maneuver, you call for support. You don't put yourself in the exact spot where the enemy has pre-positioned their fires because that's how you die, and then you're no good to anyone. I ran into the kill zone anyway. My sergeant was already coordinating the platoon's response, getting people into covered positions and returning fire. I shouted that I was moving, didn't wait for acknowledgement, just went. Stayed low, moved fast, felt rounds snapping through the air close enough that I could hear them crack past my ears. Martinez was screaming, the kind of high-pitched sound that meant shock and pain were both winning, and I locked onto that sound like a beacon. When I reached him, I grabbed his body armor with both hands and started dragging. He was a solid kid, maybe 180, and his gear added another 60 pounds. Dead weight that fought every step. My boots slipped in the dust, my back screamed in protest, and somewhere in the rational part of my brain that wasn't running on pure adrenaline, I calculated that I had maybe 10 seconds before someone adjusted their aim and put rounds directly on target. It took 12 seconds to drag Martinez to cover behind an armored Humvee. 12 seconds that felt like an hour, where every breath could have been my last and every heartbeat was borrowed time. The platoon's return fire intensified, and I could hear someone calling for medevac over the radio, voice crisp and professional despite the chaos. The firefight lasted another 8 minutes. When it finally died down and the medevac bird was inbound, Martinez grabbed my hand. His face was gray with shock and pain, but his eyes were clear and focused on mine with an intensity that made me stop trying to check his wounds and actually look at him. "Thank you, ma'am." His voice shook, but the words came out strong. "I will follow you anywhere." And in that moment, surrounded by dust and blood and the smell of cordite, I understood something that had been building since the day I enlisted, but had never crystallized into conscious thought. My father built monuments out of concrete and steel, skyscrapers that scraped the Charleston sky, commercial developments that generated millions in revenue, buildings that would stand for generations. They were impressive. They were valuable. They appeared in architecture magazines and won industry awards. But they were fundamentally empty. Hollow spaces that people moved through without connection, without loyalty, without the kind of bond that made a 19-year-old kid look at the person who'd saved his life and pledge absolute loyalty. What I was building out here in the dust and heat of Afghanistan was different. I was building an empire out of trust, out of the kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought or inherited or measured in quarterly earnings, out of bonds forged in moments where the stakes were life and death and nothing else mattered. And I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones, that what I was building would outlast every structure my father had ever put his name on. 3 months later, there was a small ceremony at Bagram where I received the Bronze Star for Valor. The medal itself was surprisingly light, just a piece of metal stamped with a star and suspended from a ribbon. But the weight it represented, the meaning behind it, was something my father would never understand. The citation talked about conspicuous gallantry and risk of life in actual combat against an armed enemy. Technical language for running into machine gun fire to drag a wounded soldier to safety. But what it really represented was the moment I'd chosen people over calculations, when I decided that Martinez's life was worth more than my own safety, and that decision had meant something. Ethan was in the small crowd of people who attended. When our eyes met, I saw pride there, and something deeper that I wasn't quite ready to name yet. After the ceremony, I found a quiet corner and called James Patterson on the satellite phone. The connection was terrible, full of delays and static, but I needed to ask him a question that had been burning in my mind since that firefight. "The trust," I began. "How much is it worth now?" $3,800,000, Miss Morrison. "The investments have performed well, and the land value continues to appreciate." "And Morrison Industries stock, what's the current price?" $127 per share. "Is there something specific you need?" I did the math quickly. With 3.8 million, I could buy 29,921 shares. That was 38.4% of the company. Close, but not enough for real power. I need 40% minimum, I told him. 40.1 would be better. What would it take to get there? There was a pause while he worked through the numbers. You'd need approximately another 150,000 to reach 40.1% at current prices. Or, and he hesitated, clearly weighing whether to suggest what came next, we could use the patent fraud as leverage. I remembered the documents Matthew had sent. The proof that my father had stolen $1.2 million from me through forged signatures and legal manipulation. Money he'd used to buy a yacht, among other personal luxuries, all while telling anyone who'd listen that I was a disappointment who'd never contributed anything of value. How would that work, I asked. We send a demand letter, private, attorney to attorney. We have proof he used money that legally belonged to you for personal purchases. That's conversion of property. We offer him a choice. Sell you 2% of his shares at $95 per share, well below market value, or we file a public lawsuit for patent fraud, conversion, and breach of fiduciary duty. The scandal would crater the company's value and reputation. He'd never agree to that, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was wrong. My father cared about two things, his company and his reputation. Both would be destroyed by a public legal battle over fraud. He'll agree, Patterson said with absolute certainty, because he's a businessman, and businessmen understand leverage. The real question is whether you're ready to use it. I thought about Martinez, about the weight of that bronze star, about the empire I was building one person at a time out here in the dust. Thought about my mother's letter and the zero next to her name in that ledger. Send the letter, I told him. Give him 48 hours to decide. 3 days later, Patterson sent an encrypted email with 2 words. He signed. I was now the owner of 40.1% of Morrison Development Corporation, the second largest shareholder. My father had just sold me enough voting power to challenge him for control, and he'd done it to avoid public exposure of his fraud. The daughter he'd valued at zero now owned nearly half his empire. When I rotated back to the States 6 weeks later, Ethan's deployment ended at the same time. We flew back on the same transport, and somewhere over the Atlantic, he asked me a question that had clearly been building for months. When we're home, would you want to get dinner? Real food, not DFAC mystery meat. I said yes before I fully processed what I was agreeing to, before the old Morrison family instinct to calculate the angles and protect my secrets could kick in. Our first real date, if you could call it that, was a hike through Congaree National Park in South Carolina. We drove out on a Saturday morning in his truck, and he led me along a trail that wound through massive old-growth trees, the kind of landscape that made you feel small in a way that was comforting rather than diminishing. We climbed to an overlook above the Congaree River, the late afternoon sun turning the water into liquid gold. And that's when he pulled 2 military dog tags from his pocket. Not the ones we wore with our information stamped into them, but blank ones. Just silver metal, waiting to be marked. On these, he began, holding up his current tags. They stamp your name, blood type, religion. Everything the Army needs to identify your body if the worst happens. His expression was serious, but his eyes held something that made my breath catch. But I want to know what you stand for, what you'd etch onto your life if you could choose anything. He handed me one of the blank tags. What would you put on here, Sarah? It wasn't a marriage proposal. It was something deeper, an invitation to build a shared legacy based not on what we owned or inherited, but on what we chose to value. A contract written not in legal language, but in the code we lived by. Honor, I said, the word coming out steady and sure. That's what I'd etch on mine. Loyalty, he said, holding up his own blank tag. That's mine. We stood there as the sun set over the river, and I realized I was holding something I'd never had before. Not just a relationship, but a partnership with someone who saw me as I actually was. Not as my father's balance sheet defined me, but I knew that if this was going to work, if we were going to build something real, I had to introduce him to the Morrison family, had to let him see the world I'd escaped from, and the man who still cast a shadow over every choice I made. 2 months before the wedding, I drove Ethan to Charleston for what I told him was just a family dinner. We met my father at Peninsula Grill, one of those restaurants that smells like old money and leather, where the waiters move like ghosts and every table is set with silverware that costs more per place setting than some people make in a week. William Morrison evaluated Ethan the way he evaluated everything, as a potential acquisition. He asked about salary first, before even pretending interest in who Ethan was as a person. When Ethan answered honestly that a captain's pay was around $6,000 a month, my father's expression shifted to something between pity and contempt. Family background came next. William wanted to know about net worth, property holdings, investments. Ethan explained that he'd grown up working class, that the army had been his path to something better, that he owned his truck and his gear, and not much else. My father leaned back, dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin, and delivered his verdict with the casual cruelty of someone who didn't even realize he was being cruel, because in his world, this was just truth. Well, at least my daughter found someone who shares her little hobby of playing war. That's fine for now. But when you two are ready to build something real, something that matters, you come see me. I can find a place for you at Morrison Industries. Not executive level, of course, but we always need competent people in operations. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't get angry or defensive. He met my father's condescending gaze with calm, unshakable confidence. And when he spoke, his voice was level and respectful, but absolutely defiant. We're already building something real, sir. A life. It was the first time I'd ever seen my father rendered completely speechless. Someone had stood up to him, not by challenging his power directly, but by refusing to acknowledge it as relevant, by operating from a value system where William Morrison's money and influence and corporate empire simply didn't matter. In the car afterward, I apologized for subjecting him to that. Ethan reached over, took my hand, and pulled an old brass compass from his pocket. It was worn smooth at the edges, the kind of tool that had been used and trusted for decades. I was going to save this for later, he admitted. It's been in my family 3 generations. My grandfather carried it through Normandy. He squeezed my hand gently. You don't need your father's empire, Sarah. You are an empire. Those words hit harder than any medal ceremony, any promotion, any recognition I'd ever received, because he saw something in me that I'd been building in secret for years, and he was telling me it was enough, that I was enough. 3 weeks before the wedding, my brother Brandon called. Not me, Ethan. He asked to meet for coffee, just the two of them, man to man. Ethan agreed, and he went to that meeting with a pen in his pocket that had a recording device built into it. He learned in Afghanistan that when someone wants to meet privately to talk about your future, you document the conversation. The transcript he brought back made my blood run cold and then hot with a fury I hadn't felt since the day I opened that envelope in Baghdad. Brandon had offered him money, $500,000 as a down payment, with $1.5 million more over 3 years, and a VP position at Morrison Industries with a $350,000 annual salary. All Ethan had to do was walk away from me. The recording captured Brandon explaining that I was going through a phase, that I always chased things that seemed meaningful and then got bored, that the military was just my latest obsession, and I'd move on to something else within a year. That Ethan shouldn't let himself get dragged down by my need to prove something to our father. Sarah will forget about you in 6 months, Brandon's voice said through the recording, tinny but clear. She'll find someone else, someone more appropriate. You'd be doing everyone a favor by making this easy. When Ethan had pushed the envelope of cash back across the table and told Brandon that I wasn't an investment but his partner, that loyalty wasn't for sale. My brother had actually threatened him. You'll regret this. Living on a soldier's salary, moving every 3 years, watching her throw her life away playing soldier when she could be building something that matters. I'm offering you an exit. Smart men take it. Ethan had looked him in the eye and delivered a line that I wished I could have seen in person. I don't need an exit from Sarah, but it's clear you need one from whatever you think loyalty means. He'd walked out, recording everything, and brought it straight to me. We sat in his apartment listening to the whole exchange, and when it ended, I felt something shift in my chest. Not surprised that Brandon had tried this, because that was exactly the kind of move I'd expect from him. But something else. Clarity. Cold, absolute clarity about what I was about to do. Keep that recording, I told Ethan. We're going to need it. The next day, a package arrived at my apartment. Massive, barely fitting through the door, emblazoned with elegant script that marked it as coming from Vera Wang. Inside was a wedding dress. Ivory silk cascading in layers, intricate lace, the kind of gown that belonged in magazines and made most women cry with joy. It had probably cost more than I made in 6 months. I looked at it and saw a costume, a uniform for the role my father wanted me to play, the beautiful, compliant daughter who knew her place and accepted her lines. I looked at my Army service uniform hanging on the back of my bedroom door. Navy blue fabric, brass buttons polished to a mirror shine, rows of ribbons telling the story of my service, the Bronze Star for Valor, the Army Commendation Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal. Those weren't decorations. They were my skin. The choice had never been clearer. I repackaged the Vera Wang gown carefully, tenderly even, because what I was about to do wasn't driven by anger. It was strategy. I drove it across Charleston to a nonprofit I'd researched called Brides Across America. They provided free wedding dresses to military brides who couldn't afford them. The woman behind the desk looked at the box, then at me, her eyes going wide when I opened it to show her what was inside. "I'd like to donate this," anonymously. Before I left, I placed a small note card on top of the tissue paper. "For a woman who understands that strength is more beautiful than silk." Walking out into the Charleston sunshine, I felt lighter than I had in months. I'd taken my father's attempt to control me, his expensive gesture of dominance, and transformed it into an act of solidarity. I'd redefined its value on my terms. The war for my wedding day had begun, and I'd just fired the opening shot. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Matthew. Just one line. "Dad's planning something for the wedding. Be careful." I texted back immediately. "I know, so am I." The night before my wedding, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the small house Ethan and I were renting, looking at my reflection and trying to recognize the woman staring back. Tomorrow, everything would change. Not because I was getting married, but because I was about to execute a plan 14 years in the making. My phone rang. Matthew, calling from a parking lot somewhere, his voice low and urgent. "Sarah, you need to know something. Dad isn't planning to give you that $7 million check Brandon mentioned. He's got something else prepared, and it's not good." "What is it?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "I don't know exactly. But I heard him talking to Brandon. He said," and Matthew's voice shook slightly. He said, "My daughter will learn her final lesson tomorrow in front of everyone." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what was coming settle onto my shoulders like body armor before a patrol. "Thank you for warning me, Matt." "Sarah," he said, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Real fear. "Are you sure about this? About confronting him?" I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection again. This time I saw clearly. Not William Morrison's failed daughter. Not the line item valued at 0. I saw Captain Sarah Catherine Morrison, Bronze Star recipient, second largest shareholder of Morrison Development Corporation, and the woman who was about to take her father's empire away from him in front of everyone who mattered to him. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. When I hung up, I pulled out the small wooden box my mother had left me. Inside, beneath the photographs and keepsakes, was the brass compass Ethan had given me and the letter she'd written before she died. I read it one more time, her words steady despite her shaking hand in those final weeks. "Build your garden where he can't reach, Sarah. Be the woman I couldn't be." Tomorrow, I would walk into St. Philip's Episcopal Church in my Army service uniform with the Bronze Star over my heart and 40.1% of Morrison Industries in my pocket. My father would try to humiliate me one final time, and I would show him exactly what $0.00 had built when given the courage to grow. The bonfire in our backyard burned low as the last of our friends departed, their truck headlights disappearing down the dark South Carolina road. Ethan and I stood together, watching the embers pulse like a heartbeat, neither of us speaking because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been communicated in the hours we'd just spent with our real family. There had been no bachelorette party with games and decorations. My world didn't work that way. Instead, we'd gathered the people who mattered, the 2 rangers who would walk me down the aisle, the Apache pilot I'd served with in Iraq, a handful of others who understood that tomorrow wasn't just a wedding, but the final battle in a war that had been fought in silence for 33 years. We'd pass bottles of Shiner Bock around the fire, told stories that made us laugh until our sides hurt, ribbed each other about past mistakes with the kind of brutal affection that only exists between people who've trusted each other with their lives. No one mentioned my father, No one talked about the Vera Wang dress or the $7 million check that wasn't coming or any of it. They were building a perimeter of support without saying the words, acknowledging through their presence that they were on my fire team for whatever came next. Ethan pulled me close as the fire died to coals. He didn't ask if I was scared, because good commanders don't ask questions they already know the answer to. Instead, he spoke with the quiet certainty of someone laying out a tactical plan. Tomorrow, whatever happens, you're not alone. I'm there. Everyone who was here tonight will be there. We face it together. He reached into his jacket and produced something that caught the firelight, turning it to liquid gold in his palm. The compass his grandfather had carried through Normandy, brass worn smooth from decades of use and trust. This got him through the worst day of his life, Ethan explained, pressing it into my hands. I'm not giving it to you because I think you'll lose your way. I'm giving it to remind you that even when you can't see a foot in front of your face, you always know your true north. Later that night, alone in our bedroom while Ethan slept the dreamless sleep of someone whose conscience was clear, I sat cross-legged on the floor with my mother's wooden box open in front of me. I'd looked through these contents 100 times over the years, but tonight, I needed to touch each piece like a talisman, drawing strength from the woman who'd fought her own quiet war and prepared the weapons I'd need to finish what she'd started. The letter was there, 8 pages of increasingly shaky handwriting that tracked the progression of her illness and the clarification of her purpose. I read it again, letting her voice fill the silent room. Be strong and courageous, she'd written in her final entry, quoting Joshua 1:9. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. She'd been preparing me for this moment my entire life. Every quiet act of resistance, every secret she'd kept, every dollar she'd hidden away and invested and grown into the weapon I'd need. My mother hadn't been weak. She'd been strategic, playing a decades-long game while appearing to surrender. My phone lit up with a text just before midnight. Matthew, brief and urgent. Dad just told Brandon that tomorrow is when you learn your place. Whatever he's planning, it's big. Be ready. I texted back 3 words. I am ready. Then I added one more line. Thank you for being the brother Mom believed you could be. His response came immediately. She'd be proud of you, Sarah. I'm sorry it took me so long to help. I set the phone aside and pulled out the final document from the wooden box. Not from my mother this time, but from James Patterson. The certificate confirming my ownership of 40.1% of Morrison Development Corporation, dated and notarized, legally unassailable. Next to it, the recording device Ethan had used when Brandon tried to bribe him, and the forensic analysis of the forged signature on the patent assignment from 14 years ago. Tomorrow, my father would try to destroy me in front of everyone who mattered to him, and I would show him that the daughter he'd valued at 0 had bought his empire out from under him while he wasn't looking. The morning of my wedding, I woke before dawn and began the ritual I'd performed countless times in barracks and tents across 2 continents. The process of putting on my uniform was meditative, each movement precise and practiced until it became muscle memory. Navy blue jacket, brass buttons fastened from bottom to top, white shirt underneath, collar points exact, ribbons aligned in perfect rows, each one representing a piece of my life that William Morrison had never bothered to understand. The bronze star for valor positioned over my heart, right where my father would aim his final blow. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a bride. I saw a captain in the United States Army, fully equipped and prepared for the most important mission of my life. The woman staring back at me had walked through fire and come out forged into something harder than her father could imagine. I picked up the compass Ethan had given me and my mother's photograph from the wooden box, my talismans. Then I walked out to meet whatever came next. St. Philip's Episcopal Church sat in the heart of historic Charleston, all white columns and ancient brick, the kind of building that had witnessed centuries of human drama and absorbed it into its walls with patient indifference. I arrived early, before most of the guests, and stood in the small room where brides were supposed to have last-minute nerves and touch up their makeup. I had no nerves, only clarity, cold and absolute. My 2 Ranger escorts arrived in their dress uniforms, moving with the controlled precision of men who'd done dangerous things and lived to practice doing them better. They didn't ask why I'd chosen to wear my uniform instead of the dress my father had sent. They simply positioned themselves on either side of me and waited. The church filled slowly. I watched through a crack in the door as guests arrived, and I cataloged them the way I'd learned to catalog threats in a combat zone. My father's business associates, men in expensive suits who moved markets with phone calls and measured success in zeros on a balance sheet. Brandon and Matthew in the front pew. Brandon wearing his smugness like cologne. Matthew looking sick with anticipation. The board members of Morrison Industries scattered throughout the pews. Independent directors who'd been willing to overlook a lot in the name of profits, but who valued their reputations more than loyalty. General Thomas Hawthorne in the third row, 4 stars gleaming on his dress uniform. A man who'd commanded divisions and whom Ethan had invited specifically for this moment without telling me why. And everywhere, woven through the civilian guests like steel threads through silk, the soldiers, rangers and officers and sergeants, men and women I'd served with or who'd served with Ethan, all of them sitting at attention even in their formal dress. Their presence transforming the church into something between a chapel and a battlefield. The organ began to play. That was my cue. The heavy oak doors swung open, and I stepped into the aisle. Every head turned, and I heard the collective intake of breath as 280 people registered that I was wearing my Army service uniform, not the designer gown everyone had been expecting. Let them stare. Let them whisper. I was done performing for an audience that had never appreciated the show. My eyes found Ethan at the far end of that crimson carpet, standing at the altar with his hands clasped behind his back and his face radiating absolute trust. He saw me, really saw me, and his expression never wavered. He'd known I would wear the uniform, had probably known before I'd fully decided myself. Then my father stepped into the aisle. He moved from the front pew where he should have been seated, positioning himself directly in my path like a roadblock made of flesh and expensive tailoring. Not waiting to give me away, waiting to stop me. For one terrible second, the trained reflex of 33 years seized control. Fear, sharp and cold, lanced through my chest. My shoulders wanted to curl inward, my breath wanted to catch, my body wanted to make itself small and apologetic, the way it had learned to do in the Morrison household, where taking up space was punished and compliance was rewarded. But then I felt the rangers on either side of me imperceptibly square their shoulders. Not aggressively, not as a threat. As a reminder, wordless and absolute. We're here. We have your back. You're not alone. That was all I needed. I took the first step. Each step down that aisle was a journey backward through memory. Every footfall a marker on the map of my father's campaign to convince me I was worthless. The Thanksgiving table where he'd written 0 next to my achievement. The mailroom in Baghdad where I'd opened an envelope containing my letter torn into 4 pieces. The moment in his study when I told him I was enlisting. And Brandon had laughed like it was the funniest joke he'd ever heard. Every step was also a step forward, toward Ethan, toward the life I'd built in silence and secrecy, toward the moment when I would stop hiding what I'd become. My father began speaking before I reached him, his voice booming through the cathedral with the practiced projection of a man accustomed to commanding attention. Sarah Catherine Morrison, you are an embarrassment to this family and everything we represent. You have chosen to disrespect me, your brothers, and the legacy of the Morrison name by appearing in this ridiculous costume instead of the appropriate dress I provided. You have spent years playing soldier instead of contributing to the family business, wasting the opportunities you were given, and now you dare to dishonor your own wedding with this display. The words washed over me like water. I'd heard variations of this speech my entire life. The only difference was the audience size. He raised his hand. Time stretched like taffy, each microsecond expanding into its own universe. I saw the arc of his arm beginning, saw the calculation in his eyes that said he'd won, that this public humiliation would finally break me into pieces small enough for him to sweep away. I saw the wedding guests frozen in their pews, caught between shock and the learned helplessness of people who'd spent their lives not interfering in William Morrison's business. But I didn't look into the hand. I looked past my father, locking my eyes on Ethan, trusting him to trust me, knowing that whatever came next, we'd planned for this. We'd wargamed every scenario. We were ready. The slap connected with a crack that silenced the organ and sucked all the oxygen from the cathedral. My head snapped to the side with the force of it. My training kicked in instantly, compartmentalizing the physical sensation, cataloging it as data rather than pain, stinging heat across my cheekbone, ringing in my ear, the coppery taste of blood where I'd bitten the inside of my mouth. My father leaned close, whiskey breath hot against my face, and delivered his final verdict in a hiss meant only for me. "You are no daughter of mine." The words should have destroyed me. That was their purpose. But instead, they clarified everything. He was right. I wasn't his daughter anymore. I was the woman who'd survived him. Before the echo of that slap faded, Ethan moved. Not running, not shouting. Moving with the controlled efficiency of someone executing a pre-planned operation. He covered the distance between us in 4 measured strides and positioned himself between me and my father like a human wall. He didn't touch William Morrison. Didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to freeze my father mid-breath, and the look in Ethan's eyes held more threat than any spoken warning could convey. Ethan turned his head slightly, his gaze finding mine, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the stunned silence. "Captain, do you require medical assistance?" Not asking the bride if she was okay. Asking the officer if she'd sustained injury in the line of duty. Reframing the entire event from family dysfunction to criminal assault. Pulling it out of my father's world and placing it squarely in mine. My father's face contorted, rage flooding back as he opened his mouth to reassert his dominance. He never got the chance. Ethan raised one hand in a simple gesture that meant stop. And when he spoke again, his voice had transformed into the crisp, formal tone of an officer documenting an incident for the record. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. An assault on a commissioned officer of the United States Army has just occurred. I'm going to ask everyone to remain in their seats." The collective gasp that rippled through the pews sounded like a physical thing, a wave of shock that crashed against the cathedral walls and rebounded. With those words, Ethan had changed reality itself. St. Philip's Episcopal Church was no longer a wedding venue. It was a crime scene. The 280 guests were no longer attendees. They were witnesses. And my father was no longer a patriarch disciplining his daughter. He was a perpetrator. From the third pew, General Thomas Hawthorne rose to his feet. He was 72 years old, a man who'd commanded troops in Desert Storm and helped shape Army doctrine for a generation. When he moved, it was with the deliberate weight of authority that didn't need to be announced because everyone who mattered already knew it was there. His voice, when he spoke, rolled through the cathedral like thunder given human form. "Attention." It wasn't a request. It was the highest command in the military lexicon, a word that every soldier from private to general had burned into their neural pathways through countless hours of drill and ceremony, a word that demanded instant, unthinking obedience. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. Throughout the cathedral, men and women in uniform rose as one, not scattered or hesitant, but in perfect synchronized movement that spoke to years of training and shared culture. I heard the sound of their heels coming together, dozens of sharp cracks blending into a single percussive note that echoed off stone walls. Rangers and captains, colonels and sergeants, veterans who'd retired decades ago, and young officers just beginning their careers, all of them standing at rigid attention, backs straight as steel rods, chins up, eyes locked forward on some distant point of honor. They formed a living wall around me, a barrier of bodies and shared purpose that said more clearly than words ever could. "We claim this woman as ours. We acknowledge her worth. And we reject your authority to judge her." They didn't look at my father. That was the most damning part. They rendered him invisible through the simple act of refusing to acknowledge his existence. And that dismissal carried more weight than any accusation. William Morrison stood in the center of that silent condemnation. And for the first time in my life, I saw him look uncertain. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that he actually stumbled backward half a step, catching himself on the edge of a pew. His eyes darted around the cathedral, searching desperately for his allies, the CEOs and board members who'd been his peers and subordinates for decades. But they weren't looking at him with support. They were looking at him with the cold calculation of people who just watched him commit career suicide in the most public way imaginable. You could lose control privately and survive. Everyone understood that humans had breaking points. But losing control in front of 280 witnesses, assaulting your daughter at her wedding while she wore her military uniform and medals, turning what should have been a family celebration into a criminal incident. That was unforgivable. That made you a liability, and successful businessmen didn't invest in liabilities. He turned to Brandon and Matthew, seeking support from his sons. Brandon had developed a sudden fascination with his Italian leather shoes. Matthew was staring at the stained glass window behind the altar. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping in his cheek. No one was coming to save William Morrison. He'd built his empire on fear and control, and the moment that control shattered, the empire collapsed like a building with no foundation. He took another step backward, then another, his retreat gaining momentum as he realized the full scope of his defeat. He walked back down the aisle, not with the confident stride of a king, but with the shuffling gait of a man who just realized everything he'd built was sand and the tide was coming in. The heavy doors at the back of the cathedral closed behind him with a sound like a tomb sealing. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood there in my uniform with Ethan beside me and a cathedral full of witnesses around me, and I felt something I'd never experienced in my father's presence. Freedom, complete and total freedom from the weight of his judgment. Father Michael, the elderly priest who'd been presiding, stepped forward. He was 80 years old, had performed hundreds of weddings, and had probably never seen anything remotely like what had just happened. But his voice when he spoke was calm and certain, carrying easily through the silent church. In our lives, we are all called to fight battles. Some are fought in distant lands, and some, he paused, his eyes finding mine with deep respect, are fought here, in the sanctuary of our own hearts. Today, we have witnessed extraordinary courage. Now let us celebrate the love that courage protects. With those words, he transformed my father's attack from a scandal into a sacrament. He'd blessed my fight, acknowledged my struggle, and elevated what William had meant as destruction into testimony of strength. Ethan took my hand and we turned together to face the altar. When it came time for our vows, every word carried weight it had never held in rehearsal. To have and to hold, to love and to cherish. I wasn't just promising those things to Ethan. I was promising them to myself. Vowing to cherish the woman I'd fought to become, to hold on to the truth of my own worth no matter who tried to convince me otherwise. When Ethan spoke his vows, promising to honor and protect me, every person in that cathedral knew he'd already proven those words with actions. They'd seen him step between me and my father. They'd witnessed him reframe an assault as a crime and force everyone present to choose sides. Our vows weren't just spoken. They were ratified by 280 witnesses who'd seen us tested and found worthy. The reception was held in a historic Charleston ballroom that smelled of old money and fresh flowers. Most of the guests filtered in looking shell-shocked, moving through the motions of congratulations and small talk while clearly processing what they'd witnessed at the church. Brandon found me first, his tie loosened and his usual arrogance replaced with barely concealed panic. He looked like a man who just realized the stock he'd bet his entire portfolio on was about to crash. "You really did it, didn't you?" His voice carried an accusation he didn't quite dare to speak aloud. "Do you have any idea what this is going to do to Morrison Industries? Dad's reputation is everything, and you just destroyed it in front of half of Charleston's business community." I looked at my oldest brother, at the man who tried to bribe my fiancé to leave me, who'd spent his entire life measuring worth in dollar signs and finding everyone except himself wanting. And I felt nothing but pity. "That's your empire, Brandon, not mine." I turned away before he could respond. There was nothing left to say to him. We lived in different worlds now, spoke different languages, valued different things. Matthew approached me more carefully, pulling me aside to a quiet corner where the band's music couldn't quite reach. "Sarah, I need to give you something." He pulled an envelope from his jacket, cream-colored and heavy, my name written on it in my father's distinctive handwriting. "Dad asked me to deliver this to you during the reception." "Wedding tradition," he said. "But," and Matthew's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, "I don't think you should open it alone." I took the envelope, feeling its weight. Too heavy for just a check. Too substantial for a simple card. Ethan appeared at my elbow, reading the situation instantly. We opened it together, Matthew staying close as witness. Inside was not a $7 million check. Instead, there was a legal document dated 14 years ago. An assignment of shares agreement that purported to show me voluntarily transferring 40% of Morrison Industries stock to my father, with my signature at the bottom and a notary seal making it official. Except I'd never signed this document, had never even seen it before this moment. Matthew's face went white as he read over my shoulder. This is how he justified keeping full control. He's been claiming you gave him your shares years ago. He's been showing this to the board whenever anyone questioned his 100% ownership. I pulled out my phone and called James Patterson. He answered on the second ring. Mr. Patterson, I need you at the Charleston Marriott Ballroom. Now, bring the share certificates proving my ownership of 40.1%, the forensic analysis of the forged patent signature, and the recording of Brandon's bribery attempt. We're ending this tonight. Sarah, what's happening? My father just gave me proof that he's been committing securities fraud for 14 years. And he did it in front of witnesses. I'll be there in 20 minutes. And Miss Morrison? I'm bringing 3 board members with me. They've been asking questions since the incident at the church. While we waited, I stood with Ethan and Matthew in a small alcove off the main ballroom, and I felt the pieces of 14 years of planning clicking into place. My father had thought he was delivering a final humiliation. Instead, he'd handed me the last piece of evidence I needed to destroy him. When Patterson arrived, he wasn't alone. With him were Dr. Richard Chen, the independent board member who'd been pressing for better governance, and 2 other directors whose faces I recognized from Morrison Industries' annual reports. Dr. Chen spoke first, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. Miss Morrison, we need to talk. What happened at the church today was unacceptable on every level. But before we can address it, we need to understand the larger situation. Your attorney indicated there are documents we should see. I could have done this privately. Could have handled it through lawyers and back channels, kept it quiet the way my father would have wanted. But that wasn't justice. That was just trading one kind of silence for another. I stepped onto the small stage where the band had been playing, and I took the microphone. The conversation in the ballroom died as people realized I was about to speak. I apologize for the interruption. My name is Sarah Catherine Morrison, and some of you know me as William Morrison's daughter. But what most of you don't know is that I'm also the second largest shareholder of Morrison Development Corporation, with 40.1% of the company's stock. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear ice shifting in glasses. For 14 years, my father has claimed to own 100% of Morrison Industries. He's shown board members and business partners forged documents supposedly proving that I transferred my inherited shares to him. But I never signed those documents. I never gave up my ownership. And tonight, he attempted to give me the forged agreement as a wedding gift, not realizing I already had proof of my actual ownership. I held up the document from the envelope alongside the certificates Patterson had brought. My father has committed securities fraud, conversion of property, and assault on a commissioned military officer. And he did all of it in front of hundreds of witnesses. As the second largest shareholder, I'm calling for an emergency board vote to remove William Morrison as CEO of Morrison Development Corporation, effective immediately. Dr. Chen stepped onto the stage beside me. The board has already discussed this matter in light of today's events at St. Philip's Church. We vote to remove William Morrison from his position as CEO, effective immediately. We further vote to invite Miss Morrison to join the board of directors and participate in the selection of interim leadership. He looked out at the assembled guests, his expression grave. Morrison Development Corporation will survive this, but it will do so under new leadership that understands the difference between power and control. The ballroom erupted in whispers and speculation, but I didn't stay to hear it. I'd said what needed saying, done what needed doing. The rest was just paperwork and consequences. Ethan found me on a small balcony overlooking Charleston Harbor, the lights of the city reflecting off dark water. He didn't ask if I was okay. He simply put his arms around me and held on while I processed what had just happened. "Does it hurt?" he asked quietly. My hand went to my cheek where the slap had landed, where a faint red mark was probably already forming. Then my hand moved to rest over my heart, where the bronze star caught the light from the ballroom. "Not anymore," I whispered, and I meant both places. 3 months later, a large flat package arrived at the house Ethan and I had bought on the outskirts of Charleston. No return address, but when we opened it, we found a professionally framed photograph that took our breath away. Someone had hired a photographer to capture the moment at St. Philip's from the choir loft. The image showed the entire cathedral from above, and you could see everything. The perfect lines of soldiers standing at attention, their uniforms creating a pattern of honor and solidarity. Me in the center, protected and supported by that human wall. And off to the side, barely in frame, my father in retreat. Mounted on a brass plaque at the bottom of the frame were words that made my eyes burn with tears I didn't try to hide. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who stand up with you. We hung it in the living room, our first and only family portrait. Perfect in its truth. 1 year to the day after my wedding, I drove to the small cemetery where my mother was buried. The South Carolina sun was warm, and a gentle breeze moved through the old oak trees that shaded the grave markers. I sat down on the grass beside her simple headstone and pulled out the letter I'd written the night before. "Hi, Mom, it's me. A lot has happened this year." I told her about the wedding, about the slap and what came after, about taking over as a board member at Morrison Industries and helping select new leadership, about my father's quiet retirement to a small condo in Florida, his empire reduced to a pension, and the knowledge that his daughter owned what he'd built. I told her about Ethan, about the life we were building together based on values instead of valuables, about receiving my promotion to major, and knowing that I'd earned every rank through competence rather than connections. But mostly, I told her thank you. Thank you for fighting in the only way you could. Thank you for hiding assets and keeping secrets and building the foundation I needed, even when it must have seemed hopeless. Thank you for believing I could finish what you started. The wind picked up, rustling the letter in my hands, and I let myself believe that somewhere, somehow she heard me, that she knew her daughter had survived, had thrived, had turned $0 into an empire built on honor instead of money. I folded the letter and placed it beneath a small stone on her grave, a permanent record of what her sacrifice had made possible. 2 years after the wedding, I was invited to speak at a leadership seminar for newly commissioned officers at Fort Bragg. The room was full of young women, lieutenants and captains, at the beginning of their military careers, all of them carrying the same mix of confidence and uncertainty I remembered from my own early days. I didn't tell them the story of my wedding. Didn't need to. The lessons mattered more than the events. Instead, I stood before them and shared the most important intelligence I'd ever gathered. People will try to tell you what you're worth. They'll put a price tag on your dreams, try to fit you into a column in their ledger. Measure your value in terms that have nothing to do with who you actually are. Don't ever believe them. I looked at each face, seeing my younger self reflected in their eager expressions. Your value isn't defined by their applause or their approval. It's defined by your actions when no one is watching, by the integrity you maintain when you're tested, by how you stand your ground when the entire world is telling you to fall back. I paused, letting the words settle. So go out there and build your own empire. Build it out of honor and courage, and the kind of loyalty that can't be purchased or inherited. Build it in the quiet moments when you choose to do what's right instead of what's easy. And build it knowing that some of the people who should support you won't, but that the people who matter will recognize what you're creating and stand with you. After the seminar ended, a young captain approached me. She looked nervous but determined, the way I must have looked that day I walked into my father's study and told him I was enlisting. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you. My family doesn't understand why I chose the military instead of the family business. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice." I thought about my mother's flower shop, about Brandon's attempted bribery, about the zero next to my name in that leather-bound ledger. The right choice, I told her, is the one that lets you look in the mirror and recognize yourself. Everything else is just noise. She nodded, understanding blooming in her expression, and I watched her walk away, with her shoulders a little straighter, watched her carry forward the lesson my mother had taught me and I was passing to her, that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property or social position. It's the courage to define your own worth and defend it against everyone who tries to tell you otherwise. That night, I sat with Ethan on our back porch, watching the sun set over the land that had once belonged to my mother. The 12 acres she'd bought in secret and held in her maiden name had become the foundation for our home, literally and metaphorically. We'd built here, on ground my father could never touch, and every day I was grateful for her foresight. Ethan pulled out the dog tags we'd exchanged on our wedding day. No longer blank, they now carried the words we'd chosen: honor, loyalty, simple concepts that had guided us through the hardest battle either of us had ever fought. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Any of it? The confrontation, going public, everything you gave up?" I thought about what I'd lost. My father's approval, which I'd never really had anyway. My brothers, who'd chosen their inheritance over their integrity. The illusion that family was defined by blood rather than choice. Then I thought about what I'd gained. The photograph on our wall showing a cathedral full of people who'd stood up when it mattered. The letter from my mother that had guided me home. The shares of a company I now helped lead with transparency and ethics. A husband who'd trusted me enough to step between me and danger without being asked. "I didn't give anything up," I told him. "I got everything I needed the day I stopped measuring my life by someone else's ledger." We sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, and I felt the weight of the brass compass in my pocket. The one that had guided Ethan's grandfather through Normandy, that Ethan had given me to remind me of my true north. I'd carried it through the hardest day of my life, and it had pointed me exactly where I needed to go. Not toward money or approval or the kind of success William Morrison would recognize. Toward honor. Toward the people who stood up when it mattered. Toward the empire I'd built one act of courage at a time. An empire that couldn't be bought or inherited or taken away because it was forged from the only currency that really mattered: trust, loyalty. The absolute certainty that your worth isn't determined by what other people write in their ledgers, but by what you write in the ledger of your own conscience. And in that ledger, the final entry read, "Paid in full."